For the record, my name is Ricardo Arroyo, District 5 City Councilor. I'm the chair of the Boston City Council Committee on Census and Redistricting, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Braden, Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Mejia, Councilor Baker, and Councilor Bach. This hearing is being recorded. It is being live streamed at bostons.gov City Council TV and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, FiOS Channel 964. Today's hearing is on Docket 0860, order for a hearing to discuss the redistricting process in the city of Boston. Specifically, this is to discuss the process and the timelines and sort of get the general information on this process out and started. We also have today the Census Bureau will be here to speak about the census numbers. They're not allowed to speak on redistricting maps or redistricting as a process. As far as that goes, they can talk about census and data. And so we'll go into all of that. But before we do, I'd like to go by order of arrival and give councilors a chance for an opening statement. Councilor Flynn, if you're ready.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Thank you for chairing this important hearing. Thank you to Commissioner Tavares at the Election Department and the dedicated and professional team at City of Boston Election Department. You mentioned, Councilor Arroyo, the census aspect. That was something that I worked on closely even during the pandemic, but really worked on it with civil rights advocates, especially in the Asian community, including the Chinese Progressive Association. We wanted to make sure every person was counted. Everyone is important, and that's what the census was all about. I think we did about 15 or 16 events in the South End and in Chinatown alone, never mind South Boston and other locations, public housing. But I guess my point is, we're heading into redistricting, but I want to make sure we also do the re-precincting correctly. It's also important that, groups that normally have close ties to each other stay in that same particular group, especially communities of color. So that's one of my main concerns and challenges. I want to make sure that the Asian community in and around the downtown area, including Chinatown, stay together. And re-precinct is a key part of it. And I want to make sure that is done right. And that heads into redistricting. And I'm proud to represent a large immigrant community. I'm proud to represent probably the largest number of residents living in public housing. And that's my goal. That's what I want to keep working on in the future. So I'm looking forward to hearing from civil rights organizations, residents, and my colleagues as well. Thank you, Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Braden.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the folks from our elections department who've been working so hard. We keep handing them a lot more work, and they did an incredible job last year with the census, and now we're looking at redistricting, and all in the midst of a very busy election cycle as well. So I want to express my gratitude and appreciation for the professionalism and hard work in that department. With regard to redistricting and re-precincting, the one question I had was with regard to Alston, had a significant decrease in population according to census, and I know from being out here that that's probably not correct. So I don't know if there's any way we can remedy that situation. But I also feel that the whole question of re-precincting is long overdue, and I hope we can address that in a fair and equitable way that reflects the diversity of our neighbourhoods and help really give full voice to all the folks that live in our neighbourhoods in that process. So thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Braden, and we will get to these questions and what we need to take in and have later. We'll do. Councillor Flaherty, I know, has been having some technical issues, but I see he is here. So, Councillor Flaherty. Okay, Councillor Mejia, and then we'll go to Councillor Flaherty once he's back.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you to the chair for holding this hearing. Redistricting is a crucial part of our democratic process and creates mechanisms for the people to flex their political muscle. It is a powerful tool that has been used with good intentions and with bad intentions. We have an opportunity here in Boston to not only create districts that best represent our city, but to create a redistricting process that centers the voices and lived experiences of our residents. Because it's not just about where we end up, but it's how we get there too. Currently in Boston, despite having a Black population of over 150,000, we have no Black representation in our state Senate. Redistricting is a tool to actualize the power of our people, and we have a responsibility and an obligation as elected officials to facilitate a democratic process that ensures that everybody has a seat at the table. I look forward to this conversation and to hearing more from our panel, and would also just like to thank the Elections Department for their hard work. As a department, you guys have, over the last few years that I've been getting to know you all, I know that the work that you do oftentimes is undervalued, but just so you know, we see you, we appreciate you, and we'll go hard for you in the next term as we continue to have these conversations. And also just want to shout out all of the advocates who have been front and center in this conversation, and looking forward to this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mejia. Councillor Flaherty, I'm not sure if yours, yep, there we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for hosting. I'm having connectivity issues this morning, so I'm sure it has something to do with the lousy weather. But in any event, look forward to the testimony. Appreciate the Election Department coming on, and look forward to solving some of these issues. We've obviously got our most recent census data, but we more importantly have constituent complaints across the city around precincts, whether it's the lines, whether it's accessibility, whether it's easy or convenient for them to get to. So anything we can do to bring our precincts in line so that they're consistent and equitable with one another, and that we're making it as easy and accessible as possible for folks to exercise their franchise and the right to vote. So with that, look forward to the testimony and look forward to offering some comments and suggestions at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Flaherty. And just to be clear, the Election Department is here to answer questions. They have an 11:30 stop, and so what we'll do is we'll have the Census Bureau present, and then you can ask questions to both. That's for all the councillors, to the Census Bureau, but also to the Election Department as they come up specifically. So, Councillor Baker.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I don't know what's going on with my video. It's not working, but just here to listen. This is my second time through this process. Got elected 10 years ago, and it was the very first exercise that I went through. It can be a difficult, daunting process, just so people are ready for it. But I think we're up to the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Baker, and then Councillor Bach.
Great. Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. Happy to be here. I think, redistricting is a really important chance every 10 years for us to make sure that everybody in our city feels represented and their voices are heard. I'd echo Councillor Flynn in that I think, keeping that ethic of keeping communities of interest together and uniting neighborhoods is really important. It's definitely something that I hear about on the parts of my district where a neighborhood feels split. That's something that I think is a real challenge, and where we have the opportunity, like Councillor Baker says, the numbers are hard sometimes, but where we have the opportunity to keep folks and neighborhoods together, we should, and where we have the opportunity to make sure that we're, creating districts that are going to enable a council that looks like the diversity of our city is really important. So, and I guess the one other thing I would say as we look at this process ahead, I know that for folks watching at home, the city, we do our districts a bit after the districts that happen for the state that are going on right now. So it'll be more of a next year exercise. But I think making sure that there are maps and data, available for folks with enough time that you can get that robust public comment and input in, and everything's not kind of 11th hour, I think is important. So looking forward to that process ahead. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening this hearing.
Thank you, everybody. And with that, I'm going to give the floor over to, and I just want to thank, I don't know if Sabino Pimonti is here. I know Commissioner Anita Tavares is here. Again, thank you all for the work you've done at the Elections Department this year and past. It's been very difficult, and we appreciate the work you do. But with that, I believe Assistant Chief Thomas Morden is here, who will do a presentation. He is representing the Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office within the U.S. Census Bureau. And with that, I'd like to give you a chance to introduce yourself and begin that, that presentation, and then we'll open the floor for questions by order of arrival.
Hi there. Just wanting to confirm that you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I'm not sure. Let's see the camera situation. For me, I don't think you can see me, but I'm not sure how to make myself visible on here.
Video's not working, but the audio is just fine.
Okay, perfect. Then I'll go ahead and just start the presentation. All right, I am sharing my screen. And we will get started here. So thank you, Councillor Arroyo. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. And I'm here to talk about the 2020 Census Redistricting Data. I'm the Assistant Chief of the Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office. And of course, as many of you are probably aware, we just got through our big release of the Redistricting Data tabulations. And so before I get into that information, I want to talk a little bit about census fundamentals and the 2020 Redistricting Data Program. And then we will talk more about the data specifically. So I'd like to thank all the counselors for talking about the efforts that they put into making sure that we got the count out in the city of Boston. Of course, we take the census because it's mandated by the US Constitution. The data are used to determine the representation within Congress. Also, the states use the data to redraw their congressional districts and legislative districts. And of course, the city of Boston as well to redraw the precincts within the city and the council districts. And then federal funds and grants and different types of support are provided to tribal, state, and local governments based on the results of the census. For the 2020 census, we aim to count every person living in the US only once and in the right place. 67% of households nationwide, roughly 2/3, self-responded to the census. The majority of those responses were via the internet, which of course the 2020 census was the first time that was an option to respond. And then roughly 1/3 of households were counted as part of the non-response follow-up operation. So collectively, we enumerated 99.9% of households across the country. Just to talk a little bit about census geography and the way that the different levels of geography for which we tabulate data. I wanted to show you this chart. This chart shows a hierarchy of all of the legal, administrative, and statistical boundaries and how they relate to one another. There's a line between the different geographies that represents a relationship between the geography. If you look at the bottom of this chart, you'll see census blocks. That's the smallest level of geography for which we tabulate data. And then all of the other geographies you see on the chart here are essentially aggregations of those census blocks to higher levels of geography. Down the middle of this chart, you can see the what we call the census backbone, and it sort of works like nesting dolls, where census blocks nest within block groups within tracts, up to counties, and so on. And then, of course, of particular interest are some of the off-center or off-spine geographies, such as voting districts and congressional districts. You can see on the left-hand side that voting districts nest within counties, congressional districts within states, places within states as examples, and so on. And then just to talk briefly about the two data products that we provided featuring 2020 census data so far. The apportionment counts, of course, were released on April 26th. And that is a count of the total state population, which includes the resident population plus the federally affiliated count overseas. So for folks that are originally or are from Boston but stationed overseas, they would have been counted in the state total count for the purposes of apportionment, right? And then moving on to the right-hand side, as far as redistricting data, we tabulated and released data for many different levels of geography, all the way down to the census block. This data set includes the resident population only, and there are many different variables and characteristics included in the data set, such as race, ethnicity, total group quarters population, and then select housing characteristics. Differential privacy in the form of what's called the top-down algorithm was applied to the redistricting data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And then we had several releases of the redistricting data. There was the legacy format release on August 12th. And then we mailed the data with easier to use tools for viewing and extraction for receipt on September 16th. That same day, we also released the data again in an easier to use format to data.census.gov. One thing I want to point out, even though there were several releases, the data set was exactly the same. It's just a matter of the format being easier to use with the most recent release. So now I'll talk a little bit about the 2020 program. Of course, our program is operated and adheres to Public Law 94-171. The mission of the program is to provide states the opportunity to identify the different geographic areas for which they would like to receive tabulations in order to perform their legislative and congressional redistricting. And of course, we aim to deliver high quality, fit for use data to the states so that they can conduct that redistricting effort. Our program is conducted in a nonpartisan manner. At the beginning of the 2020 program cycle, we reached out to the majority and minority legislative leadership in each state and requested that they designate a staff member that could serve in a nonpartisan, as the nonpartisan point of contact between the state and the Census Bureau for the duration of the program. And in a normal cycle, as the law is written, we deliver the data to the states no later than 1 year from Census Day. But of course, this cycle is very unique. There were delays due to, of course, the pandemic, as well as prioritizing the apportionment schedule to make sure that we got that data out in the time frame that we did. So the 2020 program, there are 5 phases in total in the program. The program was established in 2014. The first phase was conducted from 2015 to 2017. That was the Block Boundary Suggestion Project, where the states had the opportunity to make hold and do not hold suggestions on edges or linear features to inform the 2020 census block universe. And then phase 2 was the voting district project. This is where we received county-based voting district plans from the states, the voting districts for which the states wanted to receive the 2020 census data. And we received updates for 96% of all counties in the nation. So we had an incredible participation rate in phase 2. Phase 3, of course, we just completed, which was the data delivery, and I'll get into that a little bit more on the coming slides. Phase 4 is where we'll collect the new state legislative district and congressional district plans. That will kick off in late December, early January, after the states have had a chance to work with the data and redraw those plans. And then phase 5 is the evaluation phase. We've actually already started this phase. We have been conducting evaluations sessions on the first 2 phases of the program, since those have both been completed, and we're preparing to do a similar task with phase 3 at an upcoming conference in November. We're going to take all of the information from the states in terms of lessons learned, best practices, and use that information to design the 2030 program. At the culmination of this 2020 program, we'll release a document called the View from the States with that 2030 design. Now to talk about the phase 3 products. So first we delivered the geographic support products. Those were delivered to the states in January and February of this year and posted on our website. The purpose of these products was really to get to help the states prepare for receipt of the tabulations. So they included a set of shape files as well as reference maps and different text files. One of those, for example, if you look at the bottom of this slide, is the 2010 to 2020 block crosswalk. So it shows you the relationship between the two sets of blocks. And I have some more examples of some of these on the coming slides. So I included with the shape files, which can be used or viewed in a mapping software, such as any geographic information software. We provide the state-based shape files as well as county-based shape files and relational tables. We provided the county-based shape files so that folks in local government, county government would have the ability to easily go in and access data for their particular area of interest without having to extract it from the state-based shape files. So that's why we provided that in there. We also have, as an example, the congressional districts from the 113th as well as the 116th for comparison purposes. And then we have the 2010 and 2020 geography for many different levels of geography as well for comparison purposes there. And then on this slide here, on the left-hand side, you can see an example of one of the PDF reference maps. This is a county block reference map for the downtown Boston area. It's really hard to see the little 4-digit block codes in here because they're very small. But of course, if you were looking at the map, you'd be able to zoom in and see those. We also produced 3 other suites of maps. They were the county-based school district reference maps, the county-based census tract maps, and then the state legislative district with voting district reference maps as well. And then on the right-hand side, you can see here an example of the block assignment files. This particular one shows every block in the state of Massachusetts, and then the place code for a place that's associated with it. There are different other block assignment files as well for congressional districts, state legislative district, many different geographies. And then those correspond with the name lookup tables, which feature the names of the different geographic entities so that you can associate a name to a code. All right, let's move on now to the actual tabulation product. I'm going to get into more details about what the tables contain, but my primary focus on this slide is to inform you that the first 5 tables listed here, which are P1 through P4 and H1, are all contain all of the same variables that were included in the 2010 data. So those are easily comparable to the 2010 data. Table P5 was not included in 2010. It is a new table that is included in the 2020 suite. However, there is a comparable table in the summary file that we released in 2010, which is table P42. So there is a way to do a comparison there. Table P5 also is the group quarters population. It's the total population only. There is no demographic breakdown. And so, but like I said, we'll get into more details here about what's all included in the tables. So on this slide here, you can see that we're showing table P1 and P3. These tables include, table P1 includes race for the total population. Table P3 is race for the voting age population. Each of these tables contains the same variables. It's just a matter, of course, of the data that's presented for them. So if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see here that we have the population of one race, and there are 6 race categories. So folks could identify as a population of one race. They could identify as any combination of a population of 2 or more races. 3 or more races, and so on. So that goes all the way down to a population of 6 races. In total, there are 63 race iterations included in the data set. Tables P2 and P4 feature the Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race. The universe for P2 is specifically total population, and for P4 is the total voting age population. And you can see here at the top of these tables, there is a variable Hispanic or Latino and the account associated with that. And then for the non-Hispanic or Latino count, there's a breakdown of population and the 63 race iterations. Table H1, the H standing for housing, is the only table that features data on housing units in the redistricting data product. So the universe is total housing units, and then there's a breakdown of those that are occupied versus those that are vacant. And then, as I mentioned, table P5 is new. That is the group quarters population by group quarters type table. And there are total population breakdowns for institutionalized populations, such as correctional facilities, for adults or nursing facilities, as well as the non-institutionalized populations. So college and university student housing and military quarters as examples. All right, and we talked a little bit about this, but just to come back to the delivery dates, we delivered the redistricting data. We actually posted it on our public-facing file transfer protocol site on August 12th in a legacy format. At that time, we also released some support products, and I'll cover those shortly. And then just under 2 weeks ago, we mailed out the redistricting data on removable media with easier to use tools to the official state recipients. So those included the state governors, majority and minority legislative leadership, the redistricting commissions in the states where they are established, as well as our nonpartisan state liaisons. And then we made the data available on our primary dissemination platform, which is data.census.gov on September 16th. That same day, we released the API as well to the public. So even though we have released the easier to use data extraction tools, I do want to talk a little bit about the legacy format summary files, because that is still the best way to get the full data set with all the tabulations for all the different summary levels. The data that we released on August 12th was fully reviewed and cleared prior to the release. We had always intended to release it with the 2020 data. It's just that we made the determination we could actually provide it a little bit earlier than we could provide the data with the easier to use extraction tools, which is why we provided it on August 12th. We've been releasing the legacy format going back several decades. And importantly, it's the exact same data set that we released later with the easier to use data extraction tools. We also provided a bunch of support materials to help the states with their redistricting efforts using the legacy format. Of course, we have the technical documentation, which is very helpful in explaining the geographic content and subject content for the data. We also provided metadata explaining the definitions of all of the variables, as well as a Microsoft Access database shell and instructions to download the legacy format and import it into the Access shell and perform queries on data of interest. And then we also have scripts for different languages such as SAS and R that we posted as well to assist with working with the legacy format files. And then real quickly, the legacy formatting from 2010 to 2020 is slightly different, but mostly the same. The main differences are that we used different delimiters this time around in the data set. And then, of course, data segment 3 is new because that features table P5 that we discussed a few slides back. So now I'm going to run through a couple of the other tools that are available on our website. One of them is the 2020 Census Demographic Data Mapping Viewer, or Map Viewer. This product features data for, as you can see in the tabs on the slide here, in the screenshot, population, race alone, Hispanic origin, housing, group quarters, that type of information. And so this data is available for states, counties, and census tracts. And if you look on the screen here in the image, you can see here that you can highlight a particular geography and get the information specifically for that geography. So in this particular case, the census tract on the in East Boston has a percentage Hispanic or Latino of 37%. And this is thematic, and you can see the legend on the left-hand side that shows you what the percentages are there. So that's available for all of the different race categories that we talked about earlier as well. We also released Tableau data visualizations. These are for the state geography as well as county geographies, and feature data such as population, 18 and older, 18 and under, as well as some other facts about the states and the counties. So here's an example showing for Suffolk County, Massachusetts, for example, on the right-hand side, you can see the populations for 2010 and 2020, and how the 18 and older and under 18 populations compare for the 2 decades. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we released the data on data.census.gov on September 16th. If you're not familiar with this tool, it's a very helpful tool to find particular data points of interest. You can create custom filters, for the data set you're looking for, in this case, the PL94-171 redistricting data, as well as the different levels of geography you're interested in getting data for. You can get data for all blocks in Suffolk County, for example, and data for the city of Boston, all sorts of ways to get that data. And inside the tool, you can view, map, and download the data. So there's a lot of functionality inside the tool. Also, just to reiterate, one of our FAQs on our website, we received questions about which of the redistricting data releases are considered official. And from the Census Bureau's perspective, since they are identical, only the format is different, we consider both of the releases to be official and fit for use. And then I want to talk a little bit about the top-down algorithm as well. You may have heard about the application of differential privacy to the redistricting data in the past, over the past few months as well as years while we've been preparing for the release. And there are a few counts that are exact or invariant included in the data set. And so I want to mention those. The total population at the state level is one of those counts that is exact. Also, the number and type of occupied group quarters facilities all the way down to the block level is held invariant, as well as the total number of housing units down to the block level. Also, just for awareness, as we applied the differential privacy via the top-down algorithm to the data, the most disaggregate or smallest level of geography contains the most noise. And again, that's to avoid any disclosure of the response data that we've received from the households, right? So, blocks at that level, or blocks may look fuzzy because they have the most noise when compared to other geographies. However, when you aggregate up the blocks to a higher level of geography, they become more accurate and more fit for use. So that's an important thing to consider when looking at the data as well. What's good, though, is that the counts are consistent within tables and across tables. So even though, like, for example, the total number of housing units within a block is invariant, those that are occupied or not, that differential privacy is applied to the occupied or not information, but collectively they will still add up to the total number of housing units within the block, if that makes sense. Data should not be divided across tables, and the data may be subtracted across tables to attain new counts without a substantial decrease in accuracy. And then the other thing that we released with the redistricting data was the final demonstration data set. Now, you may have heard while we were working on determining what the appropriate privacy, the appropriate amount of privacy that should be applied to the data set to prevent disclosure avoidance. We released a series of demonstration products using the 2010 census data over the last 2 years, and received feedback from the data user community, as well as subject matter experts and CN stat about the data. And so this final demonstration data set that we produced using the 2010 census data, we applied the 2020 census production settings for the top-down algorithm to that data set and published it alongside the redistricting data so that data users and stakeholders would be able to compare the 2010 data for comparison purposes. We also have been releasing detailed summary metrics and working with other organizations as well. The American Statistical Association recently produced their findings on the data quality for the 2020 census data, and we will continue to release data quality metrics as well. Also, the data have been processed by the National Historical Geographic Information IPUMS group into tables with the original published 2010 census counts and the PPMF counts. And there's more information on the top-down algorithm and the disclosure avoidance methodology that was used on our website. So we've got a link there as well. And so real quick here, if you haven't been to our website too, I recommend that you go and explore, because there's a lot of information and useful, as I mentioned, visualizations and other things available. So there's links to the official data on our decennial census redistricting data summary files page, as well as support materials. There's also an accordion menu featuring, as I mentioned, the visualizations, blog posts, press releases, anything related to that about the data. And with that, I'm happy to turn it back over, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Please just know if there are questions that I am not able to answer, whether because I don't particularly have knowledge in that area, or I would like to work with a subject matter expert on that, I'm happy to take those down and get the appropriate answers for the group, for the council members, and get that information over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Morton. That's actually very appreciated, and thank you for your presentation. I'd also like to allow Councillor Edwards, who joined early in the presentation, but I didn't want to interrupt the presentation, to give some opening remarks if she so wishes.
Can you see and hear me?
I can hear you. Let me see, and I can see you.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I find this all to be incredibly informative, and I want to appreciate your leadership for getting ahead of this, Councillor Arroyo, and making sure we're having comprehensive conversations about what our city precincts and districts will look like, hopefully to maximize voter turnout and making sure that people feel that they have a voice. So I want to dive back into the data. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. And so it's 11:15. We have, thank you to all the councillors who stuck through there. I want to open it up by order of arrival to questions, but I want to make clear that Anita Tavares is here on behalf of the Election Commission. The only questions that they are here to answer are questions about re-precincting. This is a hearing about redistricting. Some of this stuff, especially for councillors who have been through this before, may be sort of stuff that you've already well understood, but I want to make sure that the city and the public are aware of what the process is, what the timelines are, all of these different sort of basics, if you will, so that when we begin this process in earnest, everybody knows sort of what's going on. So with that, if anybody has questions for Mr. Morton or for Ms. Tavares, I'm going to open the floor now to you, beginning with Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Council Royo. So I've been working, and I've highlighted this several times, I've been working with my constituents in District 2, including the Chinese community. So my question is, I know we're going into redistricting, but I still have some outstanding issues that we need to resolve as it relates to re-precincting. So I'm just trying to get the time frame correct. You know, if Commissioner Tavares can help me with that, I want to make sure I get the time frame correct, because I need some assistance in answers on re-precincting and making sure that my Asian and Chinese community, they have a lot in common. I just don't want them to be separated into another precinct. That's a critical part, is keeping communities of color intact and together. So that's one of my concerns, and I need to get some answers on that.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Councillor, for holding this hearing. Our goal is to go as a board, hopefully late next week, to approve the re-precincting plan for the city of Boston. I know that we do have a meeting scheduled to listen to concerns from you, Councillor, and CPA, to see if there's anything that we can do before then to address whatever concerns. I know that in one instance, we did just take a moment to look at one of your concerns, and the reason why it was laid out the way it was because we couldn't go across ward lines, and it was abutting a ward line, so we couldn't go any further. So I think once we sit down and we look at the block groups that we use to redraw some of our precincts, it'll help answer some questions.
Okay, all right. It's just a real priority for me to make sure I keep the Chinese community together. They have more in common with each other than very, very wealthy white communities. So, you know, that's a critical point that I need to make. I don't know if people understand that, but I need to keep the Chinatown and the Asian community in my district together, because they have common issues. They have common issues that I work with them on, such as food access, language access. And that's important for my constituents, that they remain engaged in District 2. You know, they might live down the street from the Ritz-Carlton, which is one of the wealthiest communities in the city, but my interest is language access, and my interest is food access and supporting immigrants. And you know, I need to make sure that they're included in this process. So that's my only concern. And I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I just want to make sure my constituents are heard during this process.
Councillor Flynn, are you ready there?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm just not happy, but I'm ready.
Councillor Braden.
The only question I had was the perceived undercount with regard to Alston. My expectation was that the population in Alston would actually increase, but it's dropped by 6% from the last census. So I don't know how that impacts our precincts, or how is there any way to remedy that undercount at this point? I am expecting not, but it seems, and I think it was COVID related, because people who lived in the neighbourhood, students who lived in the neighbourhood were sent to study remotely, and they left the city even though they were still registered and enrolled in their university and were studying from elsewhere. So I understand how it happened, but I don't know, it doesn't reflect the full population of Alston at this point. Just a big concern from the Alston-Brighton community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Braden, and I'll just answer that. Unfortunately, no, there is no way to repair that undercount on the census. Once the census numbers are the census numbers, we got to wait 10 years for another census, which is why it's so important that we get those counts in the original process, unfortunately.
The problem, I think, was, we worked very hard with the 3 big universities in our district to get a good count and to get group quarters properly tabulated. But we have a lot of students from other universities who aren't located in our district, and that's where the undercount came from. I understand how it happened, and I'm very sorry to hear we can't repair it, but that's life. Thank you.
I see you unmuted, Mr. Morton, so I'm not sure if you have a response for that.
Yeah, if I may, a couple of things I wanted to mention. The first is that as far as the ensuring an accurate count of college students, we did reach out in June of 2020, after of course, the pandemic had started and some of the operational components of the census had changed. We reached out to colleges and universities with significant off-campus student populations to help ensure they were counted in the right place for the 2020 census. So we worked with the administrations to get information as far as the names and the local addresses, as well as the alternate addresses for the students that would have been living on or near the university as of April 1st of 2020. So that's one component that I wanted to mention. The other thing is we do have another program coming up called the Count Question Resolution Program, which is where states and counties and cities and local governments could essentially review and appeal their housing unit counts, and that type of stuff. So that is another program that is coming up. I do have a couple of slides on that. They're included in the backup slides section. I believe Yasmin was going to share those with the group. But that is a mechanism by which an appeal can be made if it's determined that there is a miscount or undercount of housing units, as an example.
Thank you. That's very useful. I think we will probably try and pursue that if we can. I think we worked very hard with Harvard, BU, and BC because they are in big universities in our district. But the other universities, Berkeley School of Music and Emerson, and all the smaller colleges that students live in our neighborhood, we seem to have not been able to capture those off-campus students who were living in the district in our neighborhood. So I appreciate the opportunity to try and remedy that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. Next is Councillor Flaherty, followed by Councillor Mejia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just obviously want to follow up and add to Council Flynn with respect to the Chinese community, and also maybe expand that a little bit to the Vietnamese community over in Dorchester and any precinct, and make sure that we're sensitive and to the best of our ability try to keep the Vietnamese community intact. I think a little bigger, at least more expansive throughout Dorchester than, say, Chinatown, but particularly in around Savin Hill and Fields Corner, making sure that to the best of our ability, we're keeping, we're letting them know that their voices and their representation matters, and that we want to make sure that we're making voting accessible to them. And then as we're looking at population trends and seeing that the population growth is really to the north of the city, it's South Boston waterfront and East Boston, North End, Charleston, those neighborhoods seem to be growing quickly or quicker than the other parts of the city. So I want to get a sense from the election department with respect to those precincts that have gained population and how we're going to address that with polling locations. I know we struggle to identify appropriate polling locations that are accessible and that allow us to do what we need to do, not only for municipal and state elections, but for any special election that comes our way. So that has to be thrown into the mix here with respect to re-precincting. As important it is to take a look at those numbers and re-precinct, we also need to be identifying accessible polling locations as well. So that's it for me. I just want to add to Council Flynn and raise a flag for the Vietnamese community, and also mention the population growth and how we're going to look at that and how we're going to identify new polling locations.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. You cut off abruptly there. I'm assuming that was the end of your statement, though.
That's correct. Yeah, there was a plane flying overhead, so we're on the descending flight.
Fantastic. Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. Councilor Mejia, followed by Councilor Baker, followed by Councilor Bach.
Yes, so as usual, I'm always concerned about the process to ensure that everybody is able to have a seat in the redistricting table. So with that in mind, I'm just curious of how are we working to ensure that undocumented communities who fill out the census are impacted by our city's representation, just like everybody else, are at the table when it comes to redistricting. Just curious about what that level of engagement would look like. And then what is our plan to work alongside advocates who represent our incarcerated loved ones? As we know, the census counts incarcerated people as residing wherever their jail or prison is located, not where they actually are from. This is a dramatic impact on communities that are disproportionately incarcerated. So how are we working with advocates to address these inequities as we discuss redistricting? I mean, it's obvious to point out it's too late to advocate for changing census policy when it comes to these current census, but at least we owe our incarcerated loved ones a seat at the table in designing districts that represent their families and their loved ones. And should they become formally incarcerated themselves in the future. So I'm just curious who here can address some of that.
So I'm going to try to address both of those in our presentation that follows this. Mr. Morton is here for the census. If you have any questions directly about the census, not the redistricting process. And Ms. Tavares is here specifically about the re-precincting. If you have any questions about the re-precincting process. Those two questions are about redistricting, which we'll get into after this. I'm going to do a presentation, then we'll do questions on that, which I have both your questions parked there for now. Do you have anything for re-precincting or for the census specifically?
No.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Mejia. Councilor Baker, followed by Councilor Bach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councilor Flaherty had touched on the Vietnamese community. In the last redistricting, I lost 2 precincts that were heavily Vietnamese in Ward 16. And one of my charges will be to try and get those 2 precincts back to reunite the Vietnamese community, bring them into more of a voting bloc in Dorchester. And also he had touched on one other topic. So one of the main charges, if we just strip everything else out and we're looking at just numbers, where people are in their count, in their districts, who's low, who's high. The last time it was the same thing. It was basically Eddie's district that was heavy, that needed to shed, and the surrounding districts needed to pick up. Can we expect the same? And I don't know who this question is for, maybe Michelle, if she's been looking at the actual raw populations, just the numbers. Is the charge going to be the same? The downtown areas will be shedding, and then the surrounding districts will be picking up. Can anybody answer that?
So I'll do my best here really quick. And to be clear for folks, this is not about, this presentation specifically is not about potential maps or where we're going to go with that, more so the process. But to answer that question specifically, the process requires us to have sort of equal population or close to equal population districts And so to answer that, yes, there will have to be equal sort of population size precincts and districts, which means districts. So that means that if, for instance, you mentioned Ed Flynn's district, if District 2 has had a sharp surge in population, then to make it more equal for population for other districts, they're going to have to pick up some territory to make up that ground if they themselves have not had a sharp intake on population. So that's part of sort of the dance.
No, I understand that, but I'm saying is, is it the same 10 years later? Is it going to look the same for us if we're looking at straight population? The more southern districts going to need to pick up, and then so not without, I'd rather use their names, Lydia's district and Eddie's district and potentially Kenzie's district shedding and everybody else adding. Does it look the same? Like, have you looked at the numbers and is that what it looks like to you?
Are you saying this go around, or are you saying
this go around? That's what it was last time. Is it going to be the same sort of exercise?
So I haven't done a super deep dive on the numbers yet, but I do know that because we're required to make our districts sort of match in size, there's going to have in population size, there is going to have to be some of that. And I think though, like Seaport didn't exist in 2010, so that's an entire neighborhood that now exists within Councillor Flynn's district. And so there's certain places like that where the population certainly is reflected in the data has increased. And there's certain situations like in Councillor Braden's case where there's been an undercount, and that's sort of something we're going to have to account for with the population sort of balancing out. So I see Councillor Flaherty has his hand raised. I'm not sure if it's directly on this topic. I don't totally want to go out of, is it on this topic, Mike?
Yes, it is. I just didn't know as the chair, from your first blush, like, are there sort of one or two or three districts that have significantly, they're significantly different than, as Councilor Baker just referenced, that, you know, the sort of the 3 or 4 neighborhoods where we've seen a significant increase in population. Are there sort of 2 or 3 that have seen, have remained the same or have decreased? You know what I mean? Like, in comparison to the growth. I didn't know whether, I know you just said you haven't done sort of a deep dive yet, but do any come to mind right off the top of your head?
Certainly District 2 has had a population increase in size. I don't want to get too much into the numbers and stuff because that's going to be for follow-up hearings and all of that. But yes, certainly Council District 2 has had a sharp increase in size, and that's going to, and for folks at home who are trying to make sense of what we're talking about, Council District 2 is Ed Flynn's district. It has South Boston, it has Chinatown, and essentially parts of downtown. And essentially what that means is outlier districts around that district are going to have to pick up or lose precincts. And so that's something for a future hearing. But yes, there's a few of those.
Okay, and just 2 more things, Mr. Chair. Just for clarification for people at home, the range here is again 62.5 to 75,000 per district.
I think it's actually, so I can't say that that's the actual range in numbers. I think it's more so that, at least the way I understand it, that all of the districts be within sort of 5% of a population number. So if the numbers have increased across the board, so in other words, the population for Boston has grown as a whole since 2010. And so those numbers, as long as we're within sort of that margin of error for each district, whatever the size of the population within that is irrelevant as far as what the number is. So last time, yes, it was 65, 75. Depending on what makes sense due to the population increase now, it's possible it could be more.
Yeah, so we could, that number is flexible.
Yes, that number is flexible.
Okay, and again, 10 years ago, I was exactly in Liz's position. I think I added 3 or 4 precincts. And from what it felt like on the street, we had added population. There wasn't any apartments that were for rent or anything like that. So it felt like we had added people, but I think we were undercounted. And because of that, there was no way to go back. So we had to act as if we had, well, we didn't act as if we did add precincts to District 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Baker. Councilor Bach.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. Am I right in seeing that Commissioner Tavares has had to go?
You are correct. Commissioner Tavares did have to go. She had an 11:30 hard stop, and apparently she meant it.
Okay, so I've got a question for Tom, and then I've got a couple comments on re-precincting that I'll continue to follow up with.
And if you do have a question on re-precincting and you ask it here, we can also make sure we get an official follow-up.
Yeah, I will. So Tom, just to make clear that, so I'm clear, you're providing population level data. Sorry, you're providing population data at the level of census blocks, not just at the level of block groups, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And even though I understand that the privacy data masking makes those census block levels a little fuzzy, they're not so fuzzy that one couldn't use them for building electoral units, correct?
No, in fact, that's exactly why we produce data at that level for those blocks, because as you aggregate the blocks up, so if you take one block and you aggregate up to, like, let's say 10 blocks or 20 blocks or how many ever to form one of those districts, the data becomes more accurate and more fit for use. So at the block level, you might have an example. If you're thinking of like one city block is a good example. There are some implausible results you could see. You could see a city block where the average household size seems unrealistic, maybe 20 people per household, or maybe there's a block where you've got where there's no adults, but there's people under the age of 18 or something like that. So there are some implausible things that can happen at that smallest level of geography. But as you aggregate up to form one of those districts, as you suggested, those sort of implausible things go away. The data becomes more accurate and it's fit for use.
Yeah, so I guess the reason I'm asking about it, and Mr. Chair, I'll sort of put this on the record with you, but I'm also going to follow up with Chantal and the Election Commission on it is, I think there's a number of places in the re-precincting plan where both Eddie and I are concerned in our districts that the new precinct line we're drawing, like, it's very counterintuitive. It doesn't like kind of match with where people live and like the sense of the neighborhood, or like there's one they're drawing on mine in Beacon Hill that will put just 2 houses on Joy Street in a totally different precinct from the houses below and above them. And the conversation on that has been that we're stuck with this because these are the block groups. But in fact, it seems to me that in fact we do have population data below the block groups. We have it at the census block level. So I think for a few of these re-precincting places where it's giving us very awkward geometry, that it feels as though there is in fact data that would allow the Elections Commission to smooth those out. And so I just want to stress that on the record, because I think the conversation's been, well, we just have to accept these weirdly drawn block groups. And I don't know, Tom, if you have any insight into how the block groups got drawn and how sort of permanent and sticky they are, because they're certainly bizarre in a number of parts of my district. But I think the main thing is that it doesn't feel to me like we should necessarily be stuck with all their bizarreness on the precinct level.
Right. I don't know about, so as far as block groups go, those were defined via planning organizations. And so we worked with planning organizations and local governments as part of the Participant Statistical Areas Program, or PSAP, to define the block groups, the census tracts, and those statistical geographies. There is a population component. They are population dependent. In other words, block groups need to meet a certain threshold in terms of the number of people that live within them. Whereas blocks are a smaller level of geography. Blocks are aggregated up to form block groups, and blocks are not population dependent, right? So you don't need to meet a certain type of threshold to form a block. There are 0 housing unit blocks. There are blocks with, 1 housing unit, 2 housing units. The main components of blocks are essentially visible features. So, you can have, like, if you've got 4 bounding streets, they tend to form an individual census block. And so they're very different geographies.
Yeah, thank you. And then the other thing is what you described, the process that you guys have around the count question resolution program. My understanding is that is more focused on if population has sort of been included on the wrong side of a line between different jurisdictions or like levels, but that to Councilor Arroyo's point, there's no real, that what you guys don't really have is an appeal process where you could actually add total population to the count for the city or state. And so that it's more about border questions than it is about, a place where we just feel that we experience a significant undercount.
Well, if there could be a coverage type of correction or submission where, a number of housing units were just completely missed, or if that's what the thinking is. So there are other types of submission abilities, but we won't know all of that until the Federal Register notice is published later this fall. But when that is published, I encourage the council members to review that because we'll know more specifically about the types of appeals that will be allowed or accepted as part of the count question resolution program via that Federal Register notice.
Okay, yeah, so we'll look forward to that. And I know our BPDA research department has been working on sort of what's the potential backup to any kind of challenge or appeal that we could do to Councilor Braden's point, but I think it's a tough road. Yeah, so Mr. Chair, I guess those would be my main comments are I feel like if we're going to finally re-precinct, which I really want us to do, we should have precincts that don't make people scratch their head. Because right now we scratch our heads and we're like, well, someone in the 1920s did something crazy. But like, if we then do precincts that are bizarre for people, like, I just feel like that's a little bit of a missed opportunity on the re-precincting front. And it feels to me like there's the opportunity to go a little more granular from block groups to census blocks in a few of those places where it's just obviously bizarre. So I'm happy to continue to chase elections on that, but I know that they're trying to operate on an expedited timeline. So I just really want to raise that, like Councilor Flynn, I'm not yet satisfied with the proposal on the table. And then, I mean, look, because everybody's so curious, I mean, I ran the numbers when the data came out in August. Our average district in Boston right now on the council side is like 75,000. District 2 is up at 88. Frank, District 3 is down at 68. So I think broadly speaking, the patterns of population move that you saw last time look like they're similar. And it's going to be primarily stuff shifting out of District 2 and into other districts, particularly 3, 4, and 7. So that was my back of the envelope when I looked at it in August.
Thank you, Councilor Bach. And on the re-precincting front, I agree with you. Just for folks checking in, the re-precincting hasn't been done in about 100 plus years now, or 100 years thereabouts. And we'll sort of get into not the re-precincting, but why that might be the case. In terms of questions for Mr. Morton, first and foremost, thank you for taking the time to be here and give us all that information. But the first question that I had, and might be the only question I had, but actually it's very helpful because of the exchange with Councilor Bach that you just had. You brought up noisy blocks and fuzzy blocks. And I'm just thinking, as a person who is watching this, that sounds like a character on Sesame Street, like a fuzzy and noisy block. What exactly is a noisy block? So that at its simplest form, so that people can understand what a noisy block or a fuzzy block is.
Yes, thank you for the question. So if you have, let's say you have 3 housing units and you've got a population of 10 people and, there's different characteristics associated with each of those 10 people within a block. There is noise instituted in that block and the surrounding blocks to make sure that individual characteristics about an individual person cannot be reconstructed, if that makes sense. So depending on the type of characteristic, you might have, you know, so many people that are above the age of 18, so many that are below, or their race or ethnicity information. And the idea there is just to add noise. So you might have a population of 12 people showing up in that block as opposed to 10. You might have other types of noise injected as well to prevent disclosure, right? And that's really what I mean when I say fuzzy, if that makes sense.
That is much more helpful, I think, in general for folks who might be trying to figure out what that means. So thank you, Mr. Morden. Unless anybody raises their hand now with a question directly for Mr. Morden at the Census Bureau, I'd like to release him so we can go into sort of the next stage of this hearing. And seeing no takers on that, I am going to thank you again, Mr. Morden, for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. And so with that, now is a perfect time to thank central staff who's going to help me with this next part of this, which is I'm going to do a PowerPoint and then we'll go through that PowerPoint and I'll take questions off of that PowerPoint. Any questions I don't have answers to now, I'll make sure to get back to you on. And hopefully this gives folks enough of a sort of, for folks, and hopefully it's like a remedial class for folks who've been through it before, for folks who haven't been through it before. This should lay out some of the basics. And for folks watching at home, this hopefully lets you know what exactly we're talking about when we talk about redistricting the city council. Is it possible, Michelle, to start the slideshow? When you can. And thank you again to central staff for making these run as seamlessly as you do. Thank you so much, Michelle. And so this slideshow, or this presentation rather, is going to hopefully give a broad overview of the redistricting process for the city council over the next year and some overarching facts about the committee's role in redistricting. If we can go to slide 2. So redistricting is the process of drawing lines of districts from which public officials are elected. This process, as other councilors have noted, happens at the federal, state, and municipal level for elected officials. We are in charge of the municipal level of this process, which determines the boundaries of the 9 city council district seats for the city of Boston. Districts are redrawn according to the population data that was collected as part of the 2020 census, and the census is conducted every 10 years. As a result, the districts that are drawn based on census data last for 10 years. So in 10 years, this process will happen again. The goal of redistricting is to redraw districts that reflect population changes, which you may have heard us speaking about, and racial diversity from 10 years ago to where they stand now when the most current census and redistricting process is ongoing. On the right of this slide, you can see the current district maps for the city council, or rather for the city of Boston. So those are the current district maps that were determined, I believe in 2011 was when they officially went to a vote, but 10 years ago. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see part of the Boston City Charter, which dictates the drawing of districts. Much of what we do is determined by the city charter. This is no different. Here, it makes clear that district lines should contain as close to an equal number of inhabitants as possible. And it also says that the city of Boston is exempt from making new divisions of its territory into wards as required by state laws. And so on the right, you can see the Acts of 1982, Chapter 605, Section 3, which outlines the process for introducing a new district map. And to be clear, because there was some confusion about this earlier in the summer about the state passing they had several bills up at the House on redistricting. Boston is exempt from those. Next slide, please. So the redistricting process, one. How does redistricting work at the top? There you go. Thank you. Redistricting is based on census data. So the committee will be working to redraw districts with equal populations. When redrawing districts, the council will need to keep in mind sort of the following guidelines. The first one is preserving communities of interest, which is the concept of preserving a community's ability to stay in a single district. Compact and continuous boundaries, which is minimizing the splitting of cities or counties or crossing natural or urban boundaries, such as rivers. We don't have any mountains that I'm aware of in the city of Boston, but highways, et cetera, things of that nature. It's also important to keep in mind that the smallest building block of a district is the precinct. So precincts cannot be broken into smaller units to build districts. You can't cut a precinct in half, for instance, and have half a precinct in one district and half a precinct in another. During the redistricting process, we do not want to draw discriminatory maps where it's legally not allowed, but we also do not want to do that. The way that looks and things you would be looking for a discriminatory map is unequal populations, where each district does not have the same total population or there's abouts, a violation of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act specifically provides protections against diluting political power of Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, otherwise known as diluting the minority vote. Cracking and packing are two specific terms that you will probably hear throughout the next year as we go through redistricting. Cracking refers to spreading voters of color into small enough portions that they aren't a majority in any one place. Packing refers to putting many voters of color in a single district when they could effectively be a larger part of more districts and diluting their power in that way. The next slide, please. This is a brief overview of how the redistricting process will roll out in the committee. Today's hearing is about the 2020 census and what data was collected, as well as a sort of higher level overview of what the redistricting process will look like. In December of 2021, I believe, is the current timeline that the City of Boston's election department is anticipating that they'll have finalized their precinct changes. And while the council is not involved in re-precincting, this will, in terms of the committee on redistricting, is not involved in re-precincting, and that is at the elections department, it will certainly impact our ability to redraw districts since precincts are the building blocks of the districts. As a result, redistricting in earnest will not start until those precincts are finalized, which means likely we're not looking at starting in earnest until probably January of 2022. Following the finalizing of Boston's precincts, this committee will then begin work on the development of district maps. And simultaneously, the committee will be receiving community input and public comment on redistricting in general, and also on specific proposed maps as they come about. And so that sort of feedback would look sort of like what Councillor Bach and Councillor Flynn and Councillor Flaherty have sort of uplifted. We will give space to community members, community organizations to also sort of chime in as we go through this process, and it will be simultaneous to all of the sort of work and machinations that we're doing. The committee will then draft an ordinance. That is what the redistricting map is. It's an ordinance that will specify which wards and precincts are included in each of the 9 city council districts. The city council will then vote on that ordinance. On the right side of the screen, you can see an example of an ordinance that describes the new district map. The ordinance, once it's voted upon, assuming it passes, will then be sent to the mayor's office for their signature. The new district map that is ultimately approved will affect the municipal elections in 2023. The mayor can, and in fact, in the last redistricting process, did veto the first map that was sent their way. And so if you're asking yourself, could the city council pass a redistricting map that the mayor then vetoes, the answer is yes. And then we would have to go back to the drawing board on that map and go through that process. Next slide, please. So the redistricting timeline. On this slide, you'll sort of see the anticipated roadmap for redistricting over the next year. The process begins with the public release of the 2020 census data, which is on September 30th in a couple days. Again, the Election Commission's re-precincting process is not something that the City Council's redistricting committee is involved in, but it will affect when the committee can begin redistricting because those precincts must be finalized before we get into that process. The commission, and just to be clear, I too am hopeful that we do a re-precincting process to alleviate some of the concerns that have built up over the last 100 years. And so once that is done and finalized, and the commission has stated that it anticipates those new precincts being finalized in December of 2021, we can begin sort of the redistricting in earnest. On the end of this committee timeline, today's hearing is the first public hearing that we are holding on redistricting. We are reviewing what the census data includes eventually and what the roadmap is for the next year. From January 2022 through October of 2022, the Redistricting Committee will simultaneously be holding working sessions on district maps and holding public testimony hearings. The deadline for a new district map to be approved is at least 1 year before the next municipal election. So that's the hard stop, if you will. We have to have a new district map at least 1 year before the next municipal elections. The next municipal elections will be held in November of 2023, which means that a new map must be approved before November of 2022. So the approval deadline falls at the end of October 2022, give or take a day or two, depending on how that goes. And this is because district councilor candidates must live in their district for at least 1 year before the election to be eligible to run for office. So that's the reason for that hard stop. Next slide, please. So obviously, the committee is planning to hold hearings and working sessions on redistricting. We'll be doing that virtually via Zoom until further notice for the health and safety of the public. And also, frankly, because I do think it's worked in a way where we've had better engagement in the things that we've done. This year, the committee will be using redistricting software to redraw district maps rather than physical printed maps. This should streamline the process, especially given that the hearings and working sessions will be held virtually. The committee will also be holding public testimony hearings that will be exclusively dedicated to hearing feedback from the community and advocates, similar to if you're a person who watches a lot of city council hearings, similar to what Ways and Means has done under Councillor Bach, where we have listening sessions to hear directly from community and public testimony hearings to hear directly from community, from feedbacks in terms of what they expect to see, what they are hoping to see, and what is ongoing within the process at the relevant time. These hearings will be held both virtually and we're going to shoot for in-person as long as they're permitted by COVID-19 regulations. So hopefully we get into all of the neighborhoods. And so if somebody is watching this virtually or is a person who is an advocate or a neighborhood community leader, the hope is that we will both be giving you the ability to testify virtually, but also in person if health and safety protocols allow. The committee will also make every effort to ensure that there are translations and interpretation services available at these hearings. It's important to us that all communities be represented, regardless of whether or not you speak English as a primary language. And so we will be doing everything in our power to ensure that all voices are brought in, that translation is appropriately covered, that we are doing everything we can to ensure that all communities, regardless of what their primary language are represented at these hearings. And that all maps that will be considered will be posted publicly for the public to review so that they can adequately provide comments. And that's actually the end of the presentation. That is the last slide. Thank you, Michelle, for throwing that up. And so with that in mind, and hopefully that was a good remedial course for folks who have already been through this process, a explainer as to sort of timelines and what we're looking at here. I see that we have, let me just go back here. We've lost a few counselors, and so we will be starting with Councillor Mejia, followed by Councillor Bach, followed by Councillor Baker, followed by Councillor Bach. Actually, sorry, we're starting with Councillor Braden. Councillor Braden is still here. Councillor Braden, if you have any questions.
Thank you for that outline, and thank you for the sharing. Can you share that deck with that, or are you going to share that deck with us, Councillor?
It should already be in your inbox. So
sorry,
put that out.
I'm working off an iPad this morning, so I'm slightly restricted. Yeah, so I know there are some districts that obviously will need re-precincting. And then there's been some shifts in our, our population out here because it's sort of a discrete, District 9 is a very discrete area. This doesn't abut any other part of the neighborhood apart from that little sliver that I interact with Councillor Bach on. But there are some anomalies and some sort of weird precincting, in terms of polling places, etc. Will we have an opportunity to look at that as well, even though our district would not be changed particularly? Do you understand?
I think the polling places are part of the election department.
Yeah.
Muted myself because, of course, I think they fall into that field. But if we have a role to play, I'll make sure that we play it. Yeah, there's just some orphan parts of, the Mass Pike cuts through our district, and so there's some anomalies with regard to geographic congruence, let's say, that certain parts of the neighborhood are sliced off from the other part of their precinct by the Mass Pike. So I think that's something that we would be interested in looking at in this district. But that's more of a comment than a question. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Braden. Councillor Mejia. Councillor Mejia. All right, we'll come back to Councillor Mejia. Councillor Baker. Okay, Councillor Bach.
Councillor Roy, did you want to, I guess maybe we should wait and see if she comes back, but I know Councillor Mejia put those 2 questions on the record for you.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll get to that in a second, but yes.
Yeah, I don't think I think that the process you've laid out makes good sense. I think we're lucky to have just more open data tools and stuff than have ever existed before. And so I think, to your point, like the more ways that we can make it accessible to the public and possible for folks to follow along, the better. And I also think that's important in recognizing that there are trade-offs. Like, I think whenever you start looking at it, you find like, oh, I try to unite this neighborhood and then that cuts this neighborhood in half because of the, right? Like, and I think it's good for us in government when we're doing something kind of like hard to have it be transparent to people what it is that makes it hard. But yeah, I don't think I have any process questions for you right now.
Yeah, and I think just for folks trying to figure out, why this is hard, the precinct sizes in Boston vary wildly. So even in my own district, I have precincts that are several thousand voters and precincts that are several hundred voters. And when you're trying to reshape a map based on population, when a population size is gone up in the way that it has in other districts, what you tend to do is they tend to shed precincts. But then when you pick up a precinct, you have to take into account what that does to the racial demographics of that district, what that does from a population impact, what that does from a sort of continuous representation. There's all kinds of different things, and we end up doing these decisions as far as the map is concerned on the borders of our districts and not so much in the center of our districts, because for some of us, like Allston Brighton, like East Boston, like parts of South Boston, like parts of Dorchester, like parts of Hyde Park, it's impossible to do that. So it's really the borders that are constantly shifting sides. And so that process, as much as we can make that public, as much as we can make sort of the deliberations of that public, that's important because we will be following guidelines. It's not just willy-nilly, you take this and I take this. There's racial demographic makeups that are important. There are community makeup demographics. So for instance, I represent a significant portion of Mattapan, a significant portion of Rosendale. It is in their interest to be represented that way in terms of having sort of a bulk of a neighborhood in one place and not diluted. And so there are all kinds of decisions that we'll be making throughout this process over the next year, give or take some months to make this work for everybody. Councillor Mejia, I'm happy to let you take the floor if you have any additional questions, and I'll try to remember your 2 questions specifically. One was about access language access. The other one was about incarcerated families. And the hope is that by doing one, making sure that we make language accessibility a priority on everything that we do, whether it's a virtual hearing or an in-person hearing, and in our outreach for those things, that we are checking sort of the boxes there, and we'll be hopefully working with advocacy organizations and groups to ensure that we're bringing in communities that are often not represented, but also by making sure that we're doing things virtually and in person, hopefully, if the health protocols allow for. We're opening up opportunities for folks who may not have access to internets or stable broadband or technology to join us. And so we'll be doing sort of a combination of both of those things to hopefully address those issues. Obviously, we are a body of 13 members, and so all of the help from other members in getting folks into it and involved is going to be welcomed and appreciated. But I see you've joined us there on camera, and I want to give you your time to ask any additional questions or anything else you may have, whether it's a comment or questions, whatever it may be.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Arroyo. I really do appreciate all the efforts that we need to make to ensure that everyone is at the table. So thank you. I just wanted to, the point in regards to some of those folks who are undocumented, and you know, what efforts are going to be made to ensure that they are also involved in these conversations. And so just wanted to just continue to advocate on behalf of that population. Just wanted to just add that to the course of other things that we need to be super mindful in terms of engagement. But thank you. I don't have any other further questions or comments.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. And that's certainly something that we'll make sure we do in partnership. In the interest of meeting people where they are, there are organizations that do a number of work on immigrant rights and folks who are going through sort of an immigration process that we can reach out to and ensure are informed about sort of what we're doing, and that language accessibility will be available to those folks. I have no questions for myself, obviously. Councilor Bach, if you have anything you want to end with.
No, just thank you for doing this. I think we have the benefit that, frankly, the state side does not, of having a more drawn out and considerate process. So appreciate you starting it now.
Yeah, I do appreciate that we have the ability to do that. And for folks who are wondering how this worked out in 2010, obviously the census numbers came out in 2010. But the finalized map wasn't done until the very last, I believe, week in October of 2011, which was right at the deadline. And there was a vetoed map in that process that I believe went earlier than that, by a couple months before they got to a final map, or it might have even been a couple weeks. But the fact of the matter is we get about a year to make these determinations, and we will be doing it, unfortunately, throughout also a budget process. So there will be sort of a wrangling of all of these things, but we'll put the most due diligence that we can do to this. I want the most transparency we can have on this. I want this to be as available to folks, including the councilors, as we discuss sort of how this goes, as well as their constituents and our residents in the city. So I look forward to working with all of you moving forward. I look forward to hopefully getting re-precincted maps that folks are happy with, that they were content with, and ensuring that we keep up our advocacy there for that. And so with that, I will adjourn this hearing. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time and your attention. Thank you, Councilor Bach. Thank you, Councilor Mejia, for your diligence.
Thanks.
This meeting is adjourned.